Elise was the invisible waitress in a mafia empire, trained to blend into the wallpaper and never make eye contact. But when the city's most feared boss began dying in front of 18 world-famous doctors, she was the only one who saw the viper in the room, hidden in a gift wrapped in a gold bow. To save him, she had to do the one thing 50 women before her were fired for. She had to refuse his order and risk her life to break the rules. The atmosphere in the private lounge of the Lee estate was a heavy, suffocating kind of panic. 18 of the world's most expensive specialists crowded under gold leaf ceilings, their frantic voices a blur of medical jargon. Monitors beeped in electronic panic, and a Nobel laureate in toxicology whispered the words that meant the end of a dynasty. He's failing. Jin Lee, the man who moved the world's markets with a single call, was turning the color of a bruise, and $50,000 an hour in expertise couldn't tell them why. Standing in the shadows of the service corridor, wearing a uniform that felt like a cage and an expression of quiet resilience, was Elise. She had spent her life being part of the furniture on this estate, but right now she saw what every genius in the room had walked past 17 times. She saw the vintage tea set on the mahogany table, its rim glistening with a faint oily residue, a deadly signature her grandmother had taught her to recognize long before she ever set foot in a billionaire's lounge. Digitalis, Devil's Trumpet, Angel Killer. The answer wasn't in the blood tests. It was sitting in a ceramic pot, a gift that had arrived 3 days ago. Elise looked from the heavy mahogany doors to the security guards with shoulders like refrigerators, then at the memory of her mother's warning, stay invisible, stay safe, don't give them a reason to throw us out. She thought about the prison of silence she had lived in for years. Then she looked at Jin's shallow chest movements and the grained skin of a man who didn't know his time was up. Elise smoothed her apron, took a breath that felt like a revolution, and stepped into the light. To Jin Lee and the elite who haunted the lounge, Elise was little more than a phantom in a navy uniform, a silent fixture of the mahogany and gold. Her mother called this a blessing, believing that being invisible was the only way to survive the whims of powerful men. For years, Elise moved like smoke through the service corridors, breathing like a secret while Jin Lee fired 50 women before her for the crime of merely being noticed. She mapped the blind spots of the security cameras and timed the guards' smoke breaks, not for malice, but to ensure her existence never inconvenienced their marble lives. Then, the poison gift arrived. It was a vintage tea set, wrapped in an elaborate gold bow that screamed of false friendship. As Elise watched the head of security sign for it, she saw a yellowish, oily residue shimmer on his gloves where he brushed the porcelain. In that moment, the shadows felt cold. She recognized the pattern her grandmother had warned her about, the angel killer hidden in plain sight. For the first time, being invisible felt like a death sentence, not just for the boss, but for her soul if she chose to stay silent. The air in the service corridor usually smelled of expensive beeswax and ozone, but as Elise lingered near the delivery, a sharp, metallic tang cut through the luxury. She stared at the vintage tea set, where a faint, oily residue shimmered against the porcelain like a bruise. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the scent triggered a memory buried deep in the humid air of her grandmother's porch in Kingston. She could almost hear that raspy, steady voice, warning her that the devil's most beautiful work is always wrapped in something lovely. The older woman had taught her to recognize that sickly yellow sheen before she could even read, the signature of the angel killer. While the elite doctors upstairs relied on machines and genetic markers, Elise's inheritance was the earth and its silent poisons. That residue wasn't just a smudge, it was a death sentence for Jin Lee, a cardiac toxin meant to slow his heart until it simply forgot to beat. Elise looked at the gold bow, realizing the geniuses in the lounge were about to walk past a murder 17 times without a second glance. The sirens came at sunset, a screaming convoy of black SUVs and helicopters that descended onto the estate like mechanical birds of prey. Jin Lee had collapsed in a flurry of shattered crystal, his skin turning a terrible, deathly grayish blue as his heart began to stutter and stumble. Soon, the lounge was a war zone of medical royalty. Elise watched from the service corridor as 18 of the world's most decorated physicians, experts from Geneva, Tokyo, and Johns Hopkins, crowded around him under the crystal chandeliers. Their white coats were a frantic blur against the mahogany. Heart monitors screamed and ventilators hissed, yet for all their $50,000 an hour consultations, they were utterly lost. They pumped him with antibiotics and antivirals, searching his DNA for defects while ignoring the air around them. These titans of medicine stood over a dying man with every resource on earth at their disposal, yet they had no answers. They were looking for an invader inside his blood, never once glancing at the gift sitting 3 feet away, wrapped in gold bow and deadly as a viper. Through the glass of the service door, Elise watched the final act of desperation begin. Dr. Sterling motioned toward the surgical kit, his hands steady while his eyes betrayed a terrifying defeat. They were going to cut him open, digging through his failing system for an answer that wasn't there, a move that would stress Jin Lee's heart past the point of no return. Elise thought about her mother's voice, pleading with her to stay invisible, to stay safe, and not give them a reason to be thrown out. If she stepped forward and was wrong, they would lose everything. But then she thought about the grandmother who had placed that inheritance in our head, promising she would use it when it mattered. Elise looked at Jin's graying face and realized that being a shadow was no longer an act of survival. It was an act of cowardice. The geniuses in their white coats were about to kill a man with their own ignorance. She pulled her apron tight, felt the weight of her promise, and realized she could no longer be made of glass. Something inside Elise snapped, not like glass breaking, but like a bone pushed past its limit. She had spent her life being quiet, biting back her opinions so the powerful wouldn't be troubled by her existence. But as she watched the doctors reach for their scalpels, she realized that staying invisible was a death sentence for Jin Lee. She burst through the service door, her feet pounding against the polished marble. The air in her lungs burned like ice. Behind her, a guard's surprise turned into a shout, and the crackle of a radio filled the hall. She didn't stop. She dodged between two guards with shoulders like refrigerators, feinting left before spinning right to slip beneath their grasping arms. She was faster than their heavy boots, fueled by a desperation they couldn't understand. She reached the lounge doors and threw them open with enough force to send them crashing against the wall. 18 heads turned in outrage, but she only had eyes for the teapot, the viper, sitting mere inches from the boss's lips. Elise grabbed the teapot before Dr. Sterling could pour, the ceramic cold and heavy with death. "I said no," she screamed, her voice cracking through the sterile panic of the room. Jin Lee's eyes fluttered open, glassy, unfocused, and desperate. "Get your hands off that, waitress," a guard bellowed, his massive fingers digging into her shoulders and wrenching her arm behind her back. She felt her knees hit the marble floor, but she didn't let go. With her free hand, she grabbed the small jar of activated charcoal she had hidden in her apron, a simple black powder her grandmother called a miracle. "The plant, the tea, it's poison," she gasped as another guard's knee pressed into her spine. Bodies crashed against equipment, and machines wailed in electronic protest as she fought through the grasp of 18 world-renowned physicians. She reached Jin's lips, forcing the black paste into his mouth just as the world tilted sideways. She had gambled everything on a few grams of carbon and a grandmother's prayer. Silence fell over the room, heavy as a held breath, until Dr. Tanaka whispered that the patient's oxygen levels were rising. The grayish-blue tint faded, replaced by a warm, living brown. Jin Lee looked up at Elise, his eyes clear and focused for the first time, tracking her face with a look of profound recognition. He motioned for the guards to release her. As she pushed herself up from the cold marble, Jin did the unthinkable. This man, who moved markets with a whisper, knelt before her, a billionaire on his knees before the woman he had been taught to ignore. "I was wrong about everything," he said, his voice fractured with a humility that shattered his ruthless facade. He reached out, his hand trembling as he took hers. In that touch, the air between them shifted, charged with a sudden electric heat that had nothing to do with the monitors. The spark of a new, dangerous flame ignited in his gaze, a look of admiration that promised she would never be invisible to him again. The forensic investigation moved with a ruthless efficiency that mirrored Jin's old life, but the target had shifted. The gift was traced back to Marcus Webb, Jin's own business partner, who had weaponized a congratulatory gesture into a slow-acting assassination. Within days, the walls that defined Jin's world began to crumble. He didn't just want justice, he wanted demolition. He dismantled the shell companies and offshore accounts that had once protected his empire, but the most significant change was physical. He ordered the security fences torn down and the staff-only signs removed, turning the fortress into a bridge. In place of the rigid surveillance, he announced a new medical facility, the Miriam Carter Wellness Center. It would be a place where traditional wisdom sat alongside modern science, staffed by those who knew how to look at the whole picture rather than just test results. Jin looked at Elise, no longer as a shadow, but as his partner, as he committed his fortune to a legacy that finally prioritized the voices of the overlooked. 1 year later, the Miriam Carter Wellness Center gleamed in the afternoon sun, its glass walls reflecting a garden filled with the medicinal herbs Elise's grandmother once loved. Elise stood at the podium, no longer a phantom in a Navy uniform, but a woman whose voice carried the weight of a legacy. Beside her stood Jin Lee, his presence steady and protective. He wasn't the ruthless boss she once feared, but the partner who had helped her tear down the literal and metaphorical walls of his empire. As she spoke to the crowd of people who had once been invisible to this estate, Elise felt Jin's hand squeeze hers. He was the man who had finally seen her, looking past the service apron to the wisdom beneath, and she was the woman who had saved more than just his life. She had saved his soul. They looked at each other, a shared promise in their eyes, knowing that they were no longer defined by their prisons of shadow or gold. Together, they had built a bridge between two worlds, proving that when the overlooked are heard, the entire world begins to heal. Did Elise's courage inspire you? If you believe that wisdom can come from the most unexpected places and that no one should ever be invisible, let us know in the comments. What is one lesson your own grandmother taught you that the world needs to hear? Don't miss out on the next journey from the shadows to the light. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss a chapter of these incredible transformations.